Okay, I think it's time. So hello everyone, welcome back to the Fine Traditional Chinese Cultural series. I'm Yuan Ai from Tsinghua University Philosophy Department. Today we're going to talk about rhetoric and silence in ancient China. My course is going to be divided into the following 4 parts. First, we're going to have a very brief review of rhetoric as a tradition in the Western culture. And then we're going to talk about rhetoric as a fruitful tradition in China. After that, we're going to narrow down our focus and talk about rhetorical silence in ancient Chinese discourse. While my focus of study is ancient Chinese discourse, I also, in the meanwhile, want to invite you to think of contemporary daily life experience of the use of silence and its possible rhetorical effects. Lastly, we're going to expand our horizon and then talk about silent laughter in ancient Chinese discourse. Another important point of laughter, which is related to the silent nonverbal communication. So let's start. First, let's firstly take a look at the rhetorical tradition in the West. Rhetoric is a term came from the Greek word rhetorica, traditionally devotes to the civil art of speaking in law courts and other formal and political occasions. In the city Athens, citizens were part of the penal courts. They functioned to accuse or defend a suspect. They delivered a public speech in order to convince the jury, which was also made up of citizens. An extensive technical vocabulary and refined techniques were therefore required in order to polish their arguments. From then on, the study of rhetoric gradually became a regular part of formal education of young men, and then it pervaded not only in the debate of courtrooms, but also in poetry and in prose. Throughout the long tradition which study rhetoric, we can very briefly classify that according to the following 3 periods of time, which shows a very special feature of rhetoric of the time. This classification I use follows the scholarly contribution by Pierman. Of course, when we try to classify something, we run the risk of oversimplifying certain features during certain period of time. However, by classifying rhetoric according to the following features, it allows us to see the gradual and constant change of rhetoric in terms of its definition, its scope of study, and its object of focus. So now let's firstly take a look at ancient rhetoric. Ancient rhetoric is the art of public speech. It refers to the rhetorical theories developed and practiced in ancient Greece and Roman world. Aristotle is one of the most representative scholars who give us ideas about ancient rhetoric. He identified 3 kinds of persuasive speech, namely political, legal, and ceremonial, and 3 ways in which persuasion is accomplished, namely ethos, pathos, and logos. What do they mean? When we talk about ethos, we talk about ethical appeal. One uses it to persuade your audience by convincing them that your protagonist is credible. So you persuade others by showing that the protagonist is trustworthy. In accordance with the ethical appeal, Aristotle talks about pathos, namely emotional appeal, which is used to persuade your audience by appealing to their emotions. Finally, we are looking at the logical appeal, a kind of rhetorical persuasion that is most prevalent in contemporary discourse, which is used to persuade your audience by using facts, logic, and reason. After Aristotle, Marcus Cesaro is another philosopher we will have to look at while talking about rhetoric. He emphasized the importance of various forms of appeal in oratory and stressed that orators must be knowledgeable, not just about specific case of argumentation, but about all areas of human life and culture. If we think of what we talked about just now, we realize that in the beginning, when we talk about rhetoric, it was mainly about debates, techniques, and refined language in court and in political occasions. But here, Cicero is trying to expand the discussion of rhetoric, and they allow us to engage all areas of human life and culture. And from that perspective, he rediscovered the importance of rhetoric. After the ancient period of time, we are now entering into the classical rhetoric, which was started in the 16th century, promoted by scholars such as Pierre de la Ramée, who rejected many aspects of ancient rhetorical argumentation, except for elocution, namely the study of the ornate style. Their studies give a very strong influence for the study of rhetoric, though such an influence is not necessarily considered or positive, because the study of rhetoric, the focus of that somehow has been limited during the 16th century. The study of rhetoric becomes the study of stylistic devices. From the 16th century towards the mid-20th century, rhetoric then was mostly confined to the study of stylistic devices such as metaphors. In the meanwhile, we see a very strong tendency towards the limitation of rhetoric. This identification of rhetoric with style is often considered a limitation of the discipline of rhetoric, where rhetoric was taught to much more than just style in the ancient time. But now, with the new refined discussion of stylistic devices, when we talk about rhetoric, we might directly think of metaphors in the 16th towards 20th century. Scholars gradually feel that such a limitation of rhetoric couldn't allow us to have a deeper and a broader look at such a topic. So then we are entering then into the new rhetoric period of time. New rhetoric gradually came about through the works of scholars such as Kenneth Burke and Pierman, who was also the one give us the source of the classification of this free period of time. From the 1950s, and particularly the 1970s onwards, studies of rhetoric goes back to the ancient rhetoric, but its audience has largely grown. What does that mean? It means that during this new development of rhetoric, we're looking at different situations of studies, the different broadened genre of study for rhetoric, and the scope of its definition. First, what happens with the situation is that when new rhetoric tried to trace their source back to the ancient Greek and Roman period of time, they also realized that ancient rhetoric was devised to persuade a group of people in the presence of the speakers. It's called the public speech of rhetoric in the ancient time. But here, during the development of new rhetoric, their audiences range from one person to mankind at large. While people are invited to be present with the debates and discourse of persuasion, it is no longer necessary. An internal monologue is also included within the study of rhetoric. Second is the study of genre, which is also very important for our focus of discussion today, namely rhetoric of silence and laughter. During this new period of time, new rhetoric doesn't limit persuasion to speech or writing only, but also considers other forms of communication, including nonverbal communications, such as silence and laughter, but also things that we are now very familiar with, such as art, music, and songs. All of them can function to persuade, to motivate, and to engage with people who participate in the discourse. And this is very much related to the scope of rhetoric. The general idea in the new wave of rhetorical study is that there is no such a thing as non-rhetorical discourse. This is a very big claim because it seems that we now can look at the rhetorical dimension of things everywhere. So here, a new definition of rhetoric appears. Rhetoric is understood as a quality in discourse by which agents such as speakers, writers, but also arts, paintings, music, silence, and laughter are used to persuade, to convince, to seduce, to mesmerize their audiences. This new wave of rhetoric is very important because it gives us a bigger way and a broader way to look at the functions of rhetoric, the way rhetoric can engage with different objects, situations, genres of studies. And this will show more clearly when we go into the third part of our course and talk about silence and laughter. Before going into the deeper discussion of the ancient Chinese discourse, let's now turn to section 2 and talk about the rhetorical tradition in ancient China. Let's now move to the section 2, rhetoric as tradition in China. China also has a very long tradition of reflections, remarks, and comments on rhetoric in writing. The following ones are very selective because our culture, the Chinese culture of rhetoric, is also too broad to be comprehensively discussed today. But the following ones are those very representative that you can see discussed in depth in different kinds of textbooks. So the first one we will have to look at is called Gongsun Longzi. The Gongsun Longzi is often considered the only extant work of the classical Chinese school of names, namely in Chinese we call it Mingjia. It is an early intellectual tradition, mainly concerned with logic and philosophy of language. The Gongsun Longzi is a heterogeneous collection of 5 chapters that includes short treatises and largely fictive dialogues between an anonymous persuader and his opponent, which typically revolve around paradoxical claims. Another one we will have to look at is called Han Feizi, which is attributed to the master Han Fei, a tragic figure who was allegedly killed in the custody of King of Qin, whom Han Fei wanted to serve. Han Fei is often considered the most significant representative of the intellectual current called legalism, 法家. In the chapter, Difficulties of Persuasions, in Chinese we call it 说难, Master Han Fei takes up political and psychological problems connected with the art of political persuasion. So it differs from the traditional text, namely the School of Names, which focus on the paradox, the language and logic of the discourse. 法家 textbook represented by Master Han Fei focus on the psychological problems in relation to the art of persuasion, appears in the chapter Difficulties of Persuasion. This will be two important entries for look deeper into the ancient Chinese discourse, if you're interested in. Another one we will then encounter is called the literary mind and the carving of dragon, 文心雕龙, within which several familiar terms are discussed in depth, such as metaphor, 比, allegory, 心. Also, what's important is that rhetoric in modern Chinese called 修辞 is then firstly appeared in this textbook called Literary Mind and the Carving of Dragon, 文心雕龙. This book was written by Liu Xie, and within this book, not only the 修辞 was discussed, but also the ways of rhetorical stylistic devices are discussed. But here, what's very interesting is also that the discussion of 文心雕龙 written by Liu Xie is not about the rhetoric in speech, but more in writing. And that's one of the most representative case we can also find in this literary mind and the carving of dragons. After Liu Xie, if we look at rules of writing, in Chinese we call 文则, we will see the first systematic account of Chinese rhetoric. The rules of writing, 文则, is written by Chen Kui, which examines rhetorical devices used in various Chinese textbooks, and it is generally considered the first systematic account of Chinese rhetoric. In that sense, after 文则, we somehow have a very conscious awareness of Chinese rhetoric as a discipline of study. This differs from tracing back the Chinese rhetoric in textbooks, which didn't really explicitly engage with the methods or systematic explanations, classifications of rhetoric. But after 文则, when we take a look at the introduction of rhetoric, we will find that it has gradually fully matured in the 20th century. By being a matured discussion, it means that rhetoric in China became a recognized branch of learning. So after that, you can find a more standardized textbook, a more focused central academia to talk about rhetoric and to study and engage students with rhetoric as a branch of learning. This can further be seen from the following compilation of handbooks, textbooks in the later period of time. Here we are looking at, for example, Wang Dechun compiled a dictionary called Dictionary of Rhetoric. And then we will have Wu Zong, Zhao Keqing, all those textbooks that will give us a comprehensive and first hands-on study of rhetoric. Okay, so in the previous parts, we have briefly looked at the development and the changing connotations, object of studies of rhetoric in the West and in China, and see how rhetoric gradually becomes a branch of study, a discipline of study in China. What they remind us is that rhetoric is not an idea or a ways of persuasion dominant in either of the cultural backgrounds. What we also need to be reminded is that the definition of rhetoric is not unchanging. Not only the definition and the connotation of that is constantly changing in elaborated scope or in more narrow sense of scope, but also the object of study is changing. It could be in the beginning from the art of public speech to later on only focus on the written part and the style of device of persuasion, such as metaphors, to what we now call everything who has a rhetorical effects. So we can see the study of that has also constantly in development. In this case, the following parts, namely the study of silence and laughter in ancient China, will make full use of the new wave of rhetorical studies, where rhetoric is understood as in every genre of communication and text functions as a powerful method to persuade, to motivate, to encourage the audiences. The audience could be you, could be the written text, and somebody who reads about the text, could be the intended reader, who the text composers and editors are targeting at. So now let's move into the section 3, rhetorical silence in ancient Chinese discourse. I start to get interested in the study of silence. It is because it seems that everybody already has a very strong opinion of silence, especially in modern days of news discussions and in our daily life experience, where silence is rather understood as the opposition of language expression. And it somehow even shows the deficiency of language, in the sense that if you really have a sincere gratitude or love emotions towards somebody, the better thing you do is not to say about that, but to remain silent and then to express that in different ways. So in that sense, it seems that when modern discourse talk about silence, it's rather in opposition to language, and it even shows the limit of speech. And this was one of the first motivation that motivate me to look deeper into the ancient Chinese discourse, because my experience of reading the Chinese text tells me that the silence is more complicated than the seemingly negative view towards it. In the sense, it seems that it's not really just the deficiency of the language. It's not even the opposition to language. So when we look deeper, we find that it is actually the case. So many things can be said about the performance of silence. So now let's go back into the academic discussion and how it has been studied. As the PPT shows, the academic discussion about silence has long been dominant by the dichotomy between silence and speech as well. It seems also reflect the modern perceptions of silence. So for a long time, when scholars examine the idea of silence in ancient Chinese discourse, scholars has focused on the Taoist and Buddhist notion of unspoken teaching. In Chinese, we call it 不言之教. The unspoken teaching which reflects on the deficiencies of language and the limit of speech. What does that mean? It means that the unspoken teaching, therefore, has been understood as the most spontaneous and natural way to express certain knowledge and objects. They are unpresentable and inexpressible in language. In the Taoist discussion, one familiar term to discuss such a thing that's inexpressible is called Dao. In English, we translate it as the way. And naturally, silence in the history of intellectual discussion in ancient Chinese discourse, silence has been placed in opposition to speech and language. Language and speech which are patterned, articulated, and argumentative. In this sense, silence is seen as both revealing and avoiding the deficiency of language and the limit of speech. However, in what follows, my point is to try to show that silence is explicitly marked and explained carefully within the text that passed down to us thousands of years later. It is actively used, purposefully and meaningfully marked to persuade, inform, and motivate different audiences. In other words, in the next case studies, what I'm trying to show is that silence is anything but natural and spontaneous. Instead, the use of silence in ancient philosophers' point of view are the idea and the performance that are adopted, crafted, and performed to communicate their remonstrates, to criticize, to reveal their target ideas. So to put back with the ancient debate, my point is that silence is as argumentative as speech, and it is as arbitrary as language. It is not just a way to reflect the deficiency of language. Silence, it is a way to perform ideas, and it is carefully designed, just like language expression. Why is this important? To realize the importance and different dimension of silence, not only reveal the importance of that as a communicative act, more importantly, an awareness of and sensitivity to nonverbal communication such as laughter and silence will provide a new perspective to engage with early Chinese rhetoric, an engagement which will break through the disciplinary studies of rhetoric, but look back what was really considered the powerful ways of persuasion, communication by ancient philosophers, without putting too much of our modern discussions into their research, into their perspectives. So in such a way, when we re-examine the definition of silence in Chinese discourse, we will find that it is rather different from the definition provided by the dictionaries such as the Oxford English Dictionary, which understands silence as also an absence of account and voice of reference and meaning accordingly. The new definition of silence in early Chinese discourse, I think, could be put in such a way. It could be understood as an active means consciously chosen and carefully performed by the speaker to inform, to persuade, to remonstrate, and to motivate audiences and readers. If we read carefully with the new definition, then we won't feel too hard to recall the new wave of rhetoric and its broadened horizon of what it is rhetoric and the scope of study, the most recent wave of the study of rhetoric. And that's why I say this is very important for the study of silence, because it allows us to look broader and deeper into what has been classified as rhetoric. The new definition of silence shows that silence is not just an absence of sound, but it helps to see how it refers to the intentional pause in discourse. Because we naturally, like I'm talking now, has pause between sentences, between different points. But such a naturalized pause in between discourses, if overly extended, it could have different implications. So this will be something we will look at and marked by ancient philosophers while it is overly prolonged. Silence, while not only just an absence of count, also is related to a question deliberately left unanswered. So if somebody asks a question, targeting someone others already, but the other person just refused very directly without giving an answer. What does that mean? A refusal to give a comment when one is supposed to give a comment, or the rejection of certain action, an invitation of certain action. All of those I consider within the category of silence. So now let's take a look at the detailed examples. The features of silence in ancient Chinese discourse will be very dominant while looking at the later detailed examples. And it is exactly the following features of silence that makes the case study really interesting. And I hope when we look at the ancient stories, it could also recall some of your contemporary life, daily life experience as well. So what are the features of silence if it's not just the absence of content and avoid of meaning and connotation? First, the meaning of silence is quite ambivalent. The meaning of silence, according to scholars such as Jensen Verman, who talk about that in 1973, says that silence can be used to bond people. It can also use to separate people. When somebody feels really lonely or feels in need of a company, sometimes what we can do is not really talk to the person, but sit together with the person quietly without using any words. And in that sense, that kind of silence, being together in the space, might be understood as silent bonding. But there are also possibilities that if we lack of communication, then such a silence become a force of separation, right? Second, silence can be used to heal wounds, to heal the psychological wounds, and it can also use to tear people apart psychologically. Silence can be used to reveal information. It can also be used to hide information. Silence somehow signals certain assertion, so they can be used to give a judgment, which will be clearly seen in the following case we discuss. It could also signal somebody is thinking or not thinking. It seems that it's quite normal for us to experience that, because once reminded, it seems that the functions of silence are not so far apart from our lively experience. The study of silence and the classification of that was later developed by the scholar called Thomas Bruno. Bruno categorized silence into the following three different types. The first is the psycho-linguistic silence, which results from an accepted normal flow of speech, like what I'm doing now. There's also interactive silence, which is normally an accepted signal to exchange information or solve problems, like what we will be doing during the Q&A. Either you propose a question, I answer, or I propose a question and you answer. But this interactive silence, once overly prolonged, could threaten a relationship. For example, if it's face-to-face and I propose a question, and after such a long time, it seems that it's only silence, and I also couldn't follow up with the questions, then it seems that the atmosphere has been changed. Might be either indicating something was unclear or something was not definitely interested, right? So then it goes then to the third kind of social and cultural silence. And Bruno says that such a kind of silence is frequently practiced in many religious discourse, where silence is used for self-improvement, contemplation, or even punishment among groups. The second feature after the ambivalence of silence is then context dependency, because it is exactly because the meaning of silence can be ambivalent. It can signal somebody's thinking, or it can signal somebody's lack of attention. It could signal affections, or it could signal indifference. Therefore, when scholars trying to go deeper into what exactly somebody means while performing silence, what they focus on is the situations and the context for the interpretation of silence. To be specific, in the public space, a person's silence can either be seen as an exercise of his or her legal rights for privacy, or connected to the forced absence and suppression. It is also possible that a person's silent argument somehow turns out to be perceived as a humiliation or as disrespect, despite the intention of the performer of silence. In that sense, what we are looking at here is when somebody performs a silence, it could be understood correctly if certain ideas and values are shared. But if not, or there are some contextual, cultural, and personal differences between the use of silence, it could be misperceived. In that sense, silence could also be misused. Therefore, when we talk about silence, I think what's more important, it's not necessarily the cultural difference per se. Like it seems to be overgeneralized if we think about silence only between East and West, because as we can see, silence is so context dependent and even individually dependent. In the sense, when we look at silence, even within the same group, different values could be reflected by different group of communities while performing silence. So in the sense, instead of looking at a complete cultural study of silence, which is also an important part of the perspective, we're also looking at the context and situations where silence has been performed. Okay, now then we look at the third part, which seems already rather obvious if we talk about silence by far, that is cross-disciplinary. Silence, in fact, has been studied in multidisciplinary research. Well, not only it is a topic of interest in the field of philology, linguistic studies, literary studies, law, and art, but also philosophy. Scholars have examined silence from different approaches and perspectives, and even have used silence as a medium for the study of wider communicative, social, and cultural issues. Because wherever we are, whoever we are, while we talk, at least we can't stop but taking a pause, taking a breath. If there is a communication, there will definitely involve a more active participation, and then a less active and a refusal to participate. So silence somehow appears not only in court, in daily life, in classroom teaching, in family interactions, but also in occasions where conversation engagements are in need. And finally, we're looking at cultural and cross-cultural studies. Well, while we talk about a situation and context dependent of silence, what we should be reminded is that we shouldn't generalize silence. But if we put it into the bigger perspective, and if we have to think about, is there such a thing? In certain cultural, silence is more vividly represented. It seems that it is a way for different cultures to communicate and engage and know deeper of its differences and commonalities. Because if everybody is somehow in daily life perform silence, then we are better to reflect on in which case silence is understood towards what way. And then by doing so, if we look at cross-cultural examination, it seems that we can dispel a lot of miscommunications and confusions between different groups of people. And that's something I think is also very important, not only talking about the explicit verbal communications, but the embedded nonverbal implications or assumptions different cultural group might have had before engaging with communication. While talking about such a general ideas of what is silence, what are the features of silence, how silence has been intercultural, interdisciplinary, the following case in the Yanzi Chunqiu and in the more familiar text for Chinese readers and Chinese audience, such as the Confucian text, will show us very clear example how silence has been used carefully and explicitly marked by ancient philosophers. The first two cases we'll be looking at are from a text called Yanzi Chunqiu, Why are they special? Well, 晏子春秋 is a text dating to Warren's Day period, which contains a collection of stories, speeches, and remonstrations attributed to the person called Master Yan Ying, who is arguably the most eloquent minister in ancient Chinese text. So here is the irony that I'm trying to show here, that by engage with the text talking about the most eloquent minister Yan Ying, and see how this eloquent minister, who is very good at verbal communication, make full use of nonverbal communication such as silence, we can then see how important it is. In that sense, silence is definitely not something when you are not good at verbal communication are taken. But instead, if you are really good at communication, persuasion, and motivation, you should be able to employ both methods, especially when you are facing with somebody who seems to be more powerful and you need to persuade them. The performance of silence in 晏子春秋, the annals of Master Yan, show its strong power of being argumentative and effective. Well, admittedly, in many cases, when 晏子 adopts the performative silence, it is used to disassociate with his minister opponent, who is also very much loved by the ruler. Here, we are going to look at a case between the different choice of persuasion and different choice of political performance between Master Yan, 晏子, and his opponent called Liang Qiuzhi, who is generally classified as a yes minister, who try to endorse whatever the ruler says and show sympathy with whatever decision the ruler makes. The case we look at is about the situation when Jin Gong, so the ruler Jin, suffered from an illness for an extended period of time. So he has been sick for a long, long time. Upon such a moment, the ruler decided he has to kill his historian and ritual officials, because those two groups of people who pray for the longevity of the ruler's longevity and health didn't really do their jobs, and the ruler has still be ill. So in order to show, the ruler thinks that in order to show his own loyalty to God and pray for his own longevity, he needs to execute and kill those historians and ritual officials. Well, having such a decision as a tradition, he then summoned his favorite ministers, here including the yes minister, Liang Qiuzhi, and Master Yan, the one we said, the most eloquent minister, who also vividly and widely employs silence here. While summoning these two ministers, yes minister Liang Qiuzhi, hearing upon the ruler's decision to kill, jump out and say, yes, you should do that, it's right. While Master Yan instead kept silent. What does that mean? Here is the text that I just talked about. So I think several ideas can be seen by the context of this situation. First, the Master Yan's silence makes his own claims already without using any words before explaining why he did what he did, namely remain silent and didn't reply. Master Yan's silence shows his disagreement with Lord Jin's intention to kill. While Jin Gong asked for his advisor's opinion, he already assumed they will be in full support. With the rhetorical question, would that be acceptable? Yanzi clearly demonstrates his ideas and attitudes towards the ruler's intention to kill. His silence allows him to disassociate himself from Liang Qiuzhi's flattering endorsement, while at the same time inviting a sympathetic reading of his own silence. Master Yan didn't use words against words, but silence to dismiss words. Second, Master Yan's silence is used to arouse curiosity and to stimulate self-examination. When a set of answer is expected, silence appears surprising and therefore leads to further questioning. As such, the audience attention is directed towards Master Yan's explanation of his silence. The ruler Jing, in surprise, is also in turn stimulated to reflect on his actions. Third, the act of silence here, in fact, very sarcastically performs ruler Jing's silencing of his ministers and his people. It conveys the message that his lordship has already forced many loyal ministers and advisors to silence themselves. Master Yan's silence empowers his remonstrance by associating his own unspeakable situation with the dilemma of the people of Qi, which is ruled under Jinggong, the ruler Jing. Silence therefore becomes the only option, not only for those prayers who pray for the longevity of the ruler, but also for his people. Because if those people who speak the truth, they cannot but then blame ruler Jing and risk the serious consequences. But if those prayers pray for Jinggong, ruler Jing's longevity while covering up his mistakes, then they will be lying to the deity, which is also shouldn't be the case when the prayer needs to do something for the ruler. So here is the first case where we can see how Master Yan can already show his own ideas, his criticism, and his reason to justify his silence. The second case we will be looking at is more dramatic, because in this case, it seems that a more lie has been told, while silence is used as a morality to save some people, while in the meanwhile allowing this eloquent minister Yanzi to be a very loyal and skillful minister. It is about a grand diviner coming to the Jinggong and tell him that I can make the earth move. Upon hearing that, this ruler Jinggong asked Master Yan whether he thinks that such a thing is possible. Well, the grand diviner told me that he can make the earth move. Is it really so, Master Yan? Upon hearing that, Master Yan said nothing. He gives no reply and remains silent. What does that mean? In this case, we see how Master Yan's decision to remain silent not only allows him to fulfill his role as a loyal minister, but also confirms him as a benevolent person who doesn't want other people to get hurt. Why is so? Because while the grand diviner told the ruler that he can make the earth move, Master Yan, while keeping silent, already clearly knows that it is the prediction of the earthquake instead of just some magical power. But he didn't say that. This is because if he keeps silent, it allows him to resolve a dilemma which Master Yan would otherwise have had to face directly. Had he revealed the misleading information about the grand diviner, the diviner will probably be killed immediately because he just lied to the ruler in front of his face. However, he wouldn't have been a loyal minister if Master Yan would have seen his lord misled without speaking out, so being lied by the grand minister without really telling him the truth. So while remaining silent in public, but in private, persuading the grand diviner to confess his lies in front of the ruler himself directly, Master Yan provides merciful time and opportunity for the diviner to correct his mistakes himself. As a result, the diviner's self-correction, his life is saved. At the same time, the grand diviner is telling the truth and the ruler is well informed without being lied to. In this case, what we see is Master Yan's silence not only allows him to fulfill his role as a loyal minister, but also confirms him as a benevolent person who doesn't want to harm anybody else. Apart from Master Yan's use of silence, another series of silence has been widely discussed in Confucian text, including the one we are more familiar with, namely the 论语, the Analects, and his followers, namely the Moncius. The first case we will be looking at is from the Analects 4.24, where the text says, the superior man wished to be reserved in his speech and earnest in his conduct. This means that silence is valued in the Analects because it can direct one towards the daily performance of moral values instead of merely just talking about that verbally. Silence in ancient time or in modern contemporary culture is also understood as a very important way to store up knowledge and to learn, namely to memorize and to know about the knowledge. So here, silence is a way to indicate memorization. Third, we see the text says that when a man may be spoken with, not to speak to him is to err in reference to the man. But when a man may not be spoken with, to speak to him is to err in reference to our words. The wise err neither in regard to their man nor to their words. This means that timely silence is often understood as an act of practical wisdom and self-respect. A wise man ought to know to remain silent when others are too deaf to hear and are assailed by their own ideas and emotions. Accordingly, when one stands by a worthy man but is too quick to speak out, this is seen as rash because you already lose the opportunity to hear the wisdom from the noble man. And if you are too quick to say, you might have cutting off other people's opportunity to share with you their ideas. Confucius, while talking about timely silence, how it could be a reflection of moral performance, Moses then also reminds us the different dimension of being silent, namely focusing on other people's intention to talk and therefore decide when to remain silent. Moses says that people who rely on their noble status or on their sense of worthiness or on their seniority or on their accomplishments or on their past acquaintance to ask questions, such people I don't answer. Why is that? It is because when you are relying on your status, when you are already having a oriented mindset, or when you are already wanting certain expectations from the answers, it means you do not sincerely ask people's opinion and you do not sincerely wanting to engage with the exchange of ideas. In that sense, Moses says that don't answer. So by not answering and refusing to give a comment, you allow yourself to be integrate and to be a good person. The previous case from the Master Yan, 晏子春秋, and the Confucian text allow us to see that early Chinese philosophers not only see silence as absence of account or void of meaning and intention, but instead, silence is used as argumentative as speech and is articulated as language. Far from being natural or spontaneous, silence is strategically and theatrically performed in public and in private to communicate different ideas. The very last 5 minutes, what we'll be looking at is a different dimension of silence, namely silent laughter, how they are also used to talk about argumentation. The text we will be looking at is from the Zhuangzi, which is arguably one of the most important texts in ancient Chinese philosophical course, which is also classified as traditional Taoism. In this case, what we'll be looking at is the conversation appeared in the chapter called 天地, Heaven and Earth, in which we're going to envision a conversation between a gardener and then the high status Confucian disciple. A gardener here laughs at Zigong because when this Confucian disciple Zigong sees the gardener watering the plant using their bare hands without using any efficient tools, the Confucian disciple Zigong finds the gardener and tells him that, may I suggest you an efficient tool called Gao? If you use that, your work could be far more efficient and you could be less tiring. Faced with the Confucian disciple Zigong's expert advice, the gardener flushed with anger in the first place, but immediately laughs before talking about his ideas. What does that mean? Why this gardener laughs immediately after feeling such an anger? How do we understand that? Several ideas could be pointed out for us to also show the silent laughter become argumentative. Well, first, the gardener's reply itself is considered arrogant. Combining some mathematical meanings of Ji, namely 机械, the contrivances, 机事, the plotted things, and 机心, scheming mind. The gardener equates the use of contrivance, the tool, with the subtle doings and scheming mind, directed at Zigong himself. And naturally, laughter is used as a signifier for the gardener's humorous language to ridicule both the Confucian disciple Zigong. So by arguing against that, what the gardener did was firstly using a very humorous way to present a very constructive argument. Second, the act of laughing signals a transferal of authority and power. Why do we say that? Originally, as a disciple of Confucius, Zigong is supposed to be the one who understands the Tao, especially compared with a common farmer, a gardener. Regardless of Zigong's social status, it is clear that the gardener is presumed to know more about growing plants because that's his natural job. Zigong's attempt to teach a professional gardener how to do a better job is laughed away by the gardener and exposed for its silliness. What's more is that the gardener takes on the role of the expert of the Tao and argues that Zigong's clever method is in fact leads him away from the Tao. As such, authority and expertise are reversed, and laughter here represents a subversion of social status and moral authority. But through laughing, the gardener is able to distance himself from the angry emotions immediately aroused by Zigong. Instead, comes up with a clear argument, shows that it is in fact Zigong who doesn't possess the Tao. When laughter appears, the gardener dispels his anger towards Zigong. After laughter, the gardener diverts himself from his anger and presents his idea in a very constructive manner, a way of presenting ideas which hasn't been supposed to be expected by somebody who specializes in planting flowers. Fourth, we also see the change of atmosphere marked by laughter, which allow readers to connect with the story. Us, for example, when the gardener laughs, it includes certain laughing readers who understand the silliness of Zigong and the clever and humorous speech of the gardener. If readers can identify themselves with not only the values of the laughter, but the wit of the puns and the clever role reversal here, we consider us as appreciative readers who are brought together in a reading community who share the values with the gardener and ideas why they laugh, while others who couldn't understand why somebody laughed during certain moments are excluded from this reading and value community. Finally, laughter marks a difference in hierarchy as well as facilitating a conversation between people of different status. Though through laughter, the wit, people of lower status, such as the gardener, were able to express their subversive opinions without obviously violating certain social protocol or offending those in power, and thereby endangering their lives. The gardener was also capable of silencing and shaming the Confucian disciple without directly shutting him up. Laughter here is used as a tool to challenge power without confrontation. Laughter also helps to change the atmosphere and keeps the conversation moving without anybody conforming to the authority. So here, by looking at the idea of silence and the idea of laughter used by the most eloquent minister Yanzi, by Confucian philosophers, including Confucius and his disciple and follower Mencius, by looking at how laughter has been vividly used as the ways of confrontation and criticism by the Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, what we are looking at is the rhetorical argumentative power of silence and laughter, which should also be considered a very important perspective for ancient Chinese rhetoric. And I hope my stories shared here also reminds you of certain daily life experience, which might enrich our discussion later on. Here is the end of this course. Thank you very much for participation. Now let's wrap this up, and then we can enter into the Q&A session. Okay, I see the questions posted in the chat group. So I'll firstly read it and answer that one by one. The first question is, what is the relationship between the artistry and accuracy of expression in Chinese